Let's begin. Good evening, or good morning, no, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Namaskar. I would like to thank Embassy of India, Vivekananda Cultural Center, and Otani University for giving me such an opportunity. So let's start reconsidering the Mahāsudassana Sutta. 1. Introduction. During the Meiji era, late 19th century, when modern European Buddhist studies were introduced into Japan, Japanese Buddhists were confronted with the idea that Mahayana teachings do not stem from the historical Buddha. On the one hand, scholars accepted it as a scientific fact, and on the other hand, they tried to prove that Mahayana was orthodox Buddhism that inherited the tradition since the time of Shakyamuni Buddha, even if it could not be said to be doctrine directly taught by the Buddha. Some argued that Mahayana was not the teachings of the Buddha, but the teaching that took into account the Buddha's true intention. Some argued that the Mahayana was an evolved Buddhism, and some others argued that the concepts and expressions of Mahayana were already contained in the Nikaya literature. In 1904, Bunzaburo Matsumoto published a study of Skavati. In the book, Matsumoto compared the depiction of Skavati in the Amitabha Sutra, sacred text of Pure Land Buddhism widely followed in Japan, with classical Indian and early Buddhist literature. He concluded that Skavati originated from Uttarakuru in the Indian mythology and from the ancient city of Savatthi depicted in the Mahāsudassana Sutta of Digha Nikaya. He also thought that the king Mahāsudassana of the Mahāsudassana Sutta was a Buddhist emblem of sun worship, which later developed into the Amitabha. Professor Rhys Davids dates the formation of this sutra to the 4th or 3rd century BC, but Matsumoto claims that its original form is much older and can be traced back to the Buddha himself. Among these claims of Matsumoto, the hypothesis that Mahāsudassana evolved in Amitabha was rejected by many scholars, but similarities between Kshabati and Skavati were widely accepted by the later Buddhist scholars. Professor Kotatsu Fujita also highly prized this point of Matsumoto. In fact, the descriptions in the two texts are very similar. And since then, several scholars have conducted comparative studies of these two sutras. These studies consider the Mahāsudassana Sutta to be a single sutra. The Mahāsudassana Sutta is, however, strongly connected to the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. In other words, Mahāsudassana Sutta is a story that Buddha tells to Ananda just before his death in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. Almost all versions of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra contain the full text of the Mahāsudassana Sutta in the scene before Buddha's death. In the Pali Digha Nikaya, the Mahaparinirvana Sutta and the Mahāsudassana Sutta are independent sutra, but the fact remains that they are stories that Buddha tells just before his death. Therefore, when we think about the subject matter of the Mahāsudassana Sutta, or the king Mahāsudassana, or the meaning of the city of Savatthi, we must assume that this sutra is a part of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. From this perspective, I would like to re-examine the Mahāsudassana Sutta and consider its relevance to the smaller Skavati Viha or Amitabha Sutra. 2. The view of Buddha in the Nirvana Sutra. The Mahaparinirvana Sutra in the Digha Nikaya contains two different views on the Buddha. A. On the one hand, the sutta aims to record the death and funeral of the Buddha as a historical figure. B. But on the other hand, it shows a keen interest in proving the existence of the trans-historical Buddha as an eternal being. A. At the age of 80, Gautama realizes that his death is imminent and sets out on a journey along the Ganges River from the royal castle, visiting villages and towns familiar to him and meeting for a last time with the people who adored Buddha. At Vesari, he feels severe pain and announces his death to his disciples. After that, he recovers a little, but the meal offered by Chunda makes him very ill, and he runs out of energy in Kushinara. After his death, he is cremated, and his remains are distributed. These are the records of the human Buddha as a historical fact. B. On the other hand, Buddha himself talks about the universality and eternity of the Buddha. In Vesari, he tells Ananda, since the Tathagata has mastered the 4 bases of supernatural power, he can last for eon or even longer. In addition, when receiving the offering from Chunda, he also emphasizes the great merit of worshipping the Tathagata. Further, just before his death, he talks about the past and future Buddhas and says that Buddha will definitely appear in the world even after Gautama's death. All these tell about the trans-historical Buddha as an eternal being. And the basis for such eternity of Buddha is Dhamma. Immediately after stating that he would soon pass away, he says that his disciples should henceforth take refuge in the Dhamma, instead of the Buddha. He also preaches do not depend on person, but depend on Dhamma. These teachings tells us that Buddha as Dhamma will replace the dying human Buddha. In this sense, the Mahaparinibbana Sutra already clearly expressed the idea of seeing Buddha's body as a Dharmakaya rather than as Rupakaya. 3. The theme of Mahāsudassana Sutta. However, the new view on Buddha in B is not conveyed to Ananda. When he hears that Buddha can prolong life, he does not understand what it means. And when he is told to take refuge in the Dhamma, still he remains dependent on human Buddha in front of him. And fearing that Buddha will soon die, he pleads with him not to die until he goes to some big city. His attitude is not appropriate for an ordained monk. However, many of the lay followers probably had the same feelings as him. At the time when Buddha, the refugees and the teacher, ceases to exist as a historical person and becomes a trans-historical Dhamma, there are disciples who still cannot give up their love and attachment to Gautama himself. How can such disciples' view of Buddha be led to the Dhamma? As an answer to these questions, the Buddha narrated the Mahāsudassana Sutta to Ananda. 4. The other world named Ksavati. Buddha reproached Ananda for calling Kushinara a small town on the frontier, because this place was once a city called Ksavati, ruled by King Mahāsudassana, and was very prosperous. He then tells in detail how prosperous this city used to be. Here we can see that scenery of the city resembles Ksavati of the Pure Land. So the examples I give, and some examples at footnote 8, but it is very long. Mahāsudassana Sutta Pali text, and next English translation by Professor Rhys Davids. And next, correspond part of the Sanskrit text of the smaller Sukhavati Vyuha, and its translation by Professor Gomez. So please skip to page number 6. However, for the king, the splendor of the city, the beauty of the territory, and the abundance of treasures and objects of desire, attachment, and disgust. Therefore, even though he is blessed with the virtues of longevity and good health as a universal monarch, he abandons his life and dies. Then the city of Ksabati, that was the embodiment of the king's spiritual, followed him and perished. However, this showed the people the truth of the impermanence of all things and the bliss of Nibbana. Therefore, this place should not be called a small town in the frontier. Rather, it is the most suitable city for the Buddha to enter the Nibbana. In this way, the Buddha superimposed the real world of Kshinara on the distant past of Ksabati and described in detail the prosperity of the past. He also tries to soothe Ananda, who has worried about losing his teacher. In other words, the Mahāsudassana Sutta is a visual discourse that avoids conceptual explanations so that Ananda and the common people can understand with their sense the significance of Buddha's attainment of Nibbana in this land and the attainment of the eternal Buddhahood. 5. For infinite minds. However, King Mahāsudassana was a universal monarch, not a Buddha, and his death was not the parinibbana. It is said that king was born as Brahma after his death. This is because the king devoted himself for a long time to practice the meditative absorption of the material sphere and the four infinite minds, apamana, in the palace named Dhamma. The four infinite mind meditation that infinitely expand the souls of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic, and equanimity towards all sentient beings in all directions and fill the mind without hatred or harm. It was also called dwelling in the abode of Brahma, Brahma Vihara, and was interpreted to mean that if one practiced it, one would be born in the world of Brahma after death. And the expression dwelling in the abode of Brahma or dwelling with Brahma was probably originally used in the sense of approaching liberation or Nibbana as the ultimate result of the practice of Buddhism. 6. The four infinite minds and extinction of karma. Furthermore, the four infinite minds bring about the extinction of karma. In other words, as the canonical text says, when the mind is filled with infinite compassion for all sentient beings, finite karma does not remain there and does not stay there. As is well known, according to the principle of early Buddhism, good and bad karma always leads to result. To break the chain of karma and its result, transcend transmigration, and attain Nibbana, one must destroy the attachment. However, there are some exceptions. One of them is the practice of the four infinite mind. Before entering the Dhamma palace, King Mahāsudassana looked back on his previous life and recognizes that he became universal monarch because of the rewards of his past good karma, such as the making of offerings and observing the precept. However, it is happening based on the law of karma. Therefore, he practices the four infinite mind, destroys his own karma, and transcends the world of transmigration to attain Brahma dwelling. Beyond that, there is attainment of Nibbana. With the death of the king, prosperous city fell into ruin. However, the fact that this place is still the city that leads people to Nibbana is revealed by the fact that Gautama Buddha, after leading many people with his great compassion, is now dying here at Kshinara. In order to make the ordinary people and not yet well-practiced disciples like Ananda to understand the significance of it, Buddha conveyed it visually in the form of the story of the majesty of Ksabati. 7. Conclusion. There is no savior like Amitabha in Ksabati of the Mahāsudassana Sutta. Although the scenes of Ksabati and Skabati are similar, the images of the king, Mahāsudassana, and Amitabha Buddha are very different, and Matsumoto's hypothesis that the former transformed into the later is still unacceptable. However, There are similarities between two texts that go beyond mere description. This is the principle of transcendence of karma and salvation given through the medium of a mythical utopia. The practice of the four infinite minds at Ksabati by King Mahāsudassana means that there he transcends the karma and samsara. The four infinite minds is a meditation in which one hopes for the salvation of all sentient beings with infinite compassion. Through this meditation, the king's karma is purified and he becomes a Brahma. It implies the path to Nibbana. The scripture returns to the original context of the Mahaparinibbana Sutta by saying that the royal city of Ksabati is a present Kshinara. Ksabati of the Mahāsudassana Sutta does not have a personal savior. Therefore, there is no idea that by repeatedly chanting the name of the savior, one can obtain the bliss. This text, however, depicts the Buddha's passing away as a revelation of an eternal law of impermanence and bliss through the visual representation of the majesty of Ksabati. It also shows that this ideal world is separated from the distant past, but at the same time, it is the actual place of Kshinara that exists before our eyes. It is not too difficult to find a common ground with the Pure Land philosophy, in which the distant other world transcends the concept of time and space to become a place of immediate salvation for people living in the present world. Thank you very much. Dhanyavad.